In this video, we're going to be talking about integrated development environments, also known as
IDEs.
So, Brian, could you please explain to me, with your massive intellect, what an IDE actually is?
An integrated development environment.
Okay, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching.
So an IDE
Oh, wait, there's more.
An IDE is basically the application, the software that you use to write a program. Now, some time ago, writing a program didn't really require all-in-one program. You would use a text editor. After the text editor is used to type out the file, save the file, goes to compiler. Then after the compiler is run, you do a build automation. Sometimes you have a GUI tool for graphical user interface stuff. You'd have a debugger if you have a problem with your code. You have separate tools and programs to check for memory leaks. So now we've taken all of those programs and put them all together in one, which is considered the IDE. So although sometimes an IDE is used for, like Visual Studio, for example, is an IDE used for particular languages, some are more generic, like Eclipse.
Yeah, because Eclipse, you can use multiple languages.
It's basically like a portal for all of your development programs. So we're gonna kind of take a look at these and look to see why they're so important.
Now, Brian made a comment that it used to be a text editor and a compiler. Now, I will disagree with Brian there because in many instances I will still use a text editor and a compiler. And it is, for some things, that's great. And it's great for learning because when you start using IDEs, it's kind of important for you to see, well, what is the IDE actually doing? And you won't really appreciate what IDEs do unless you get involved in this sort of thing, which is like build compilation procedures that are more complicated than they really have to be. And we may later do some examples with this where we're actually compiling a program using make, install, which isn't that complicated, but it's more complicated than it has to be.
It's more than one click of a button.
Yeah, well, yes. And if you run through make and it says, oh, well, this is missing, or the path of this file is incorrect, or your libraries are in the wrong directory, that could be a pain in the butt to go through and edit.
And it just burns your time, your valuable time as a developer. Just,
Yeah.
It makes you not quite as efficient.
So it puts everything you need in one place. Like Brian said, every little piece of tool that you need, an ASCII text editor and a compiler, build procedures and that kind of thing, is all in one application. It also simplifies project distribution. So instead of me taking 50,000 pieces of source code and emailing it to someone and saying, hey, here's like a 5-page compilation procedure that you need to do this, I can just zip up my project file or my project directory and send it to you, and you can open up on your machine.
They will also integrate with source control programs.
Yeah, right.
Like Vault and Subversion and whatever. So that if you're developing with other people, that packaging up of the source code also packages up and distributes among the other developers. So you can see if somebody else is working on or modified a file or whatever the case is.
It's also kind of cool with automatic version control, where build counts are stored, so when you can look back at your different versions. Many IDEs make it very easy to publish your applications. Like Visual Studio, you can have setup projects that do installation programs for your software. So if you build a service, you don't actually have to go through the whole process of doing the install util. That just happens automatically through the IDE.
Right. Or if you're developing something for a website that's on a web server, you can, from the IDE, publish what you build to the web server. Or to another web server. Very
good point. Like when you're doing ASP, you actually publish it. Good point. Here's a sampling of some popular IDEs that are in relatively widespread use today. Now, some people may argue with a couple of these, but, this is our list. This is what we see. We see in the Windows environment, for the most part, Visual Studio is the gold standard. And I will say, I'm not a big Windows homer. I do program in Windows a lot, and I do like Windows. I will say Visual Studio is probably the best development tool that I've ever used.
Yeah, it's very nice.
And that's not to say that I don't like Unix and Linux. I love it. I love those platforms, but Visual Studio just Microsoft really has a leg up.
Right.
On pretty much most of the competition.
And you see that there's a lot of applications developed for Windows, not as many developed for Linux, not as many developed for the Mac. And one of the big reasons really comes down to Visual Studio.
Yeah.
Visual Studio is a key component in Microsoft's success.
Turbo C++ is also in widespread use. You see this in colleges a lot. Dev C++ is kind of dying, but it's sadly because I love Dev C++. But it's kind of a very basic C++ IDE, and it's great for developing C and C++ programs. And in Linux, Brian, talk about what we have in Linux.
You have KDE Develop.
Or KDevelop.
And this is an IDE for the KDE shell in Linux. Then there's Anjuta, another open source Linux IDE for C++
Which
and other languages.
It's very similar to Dev C++.
Yep. But not specifically tailored to KDE. So this is more commonly used for the GNOME shell. Then Sun Studio for Java and other languages like that.
Next we have the Mac OS. There are more, but the exclusiveness is Xcode.
Yep.
There is a version, actually KDE, there's actually a Mac, KDevelop, there's actually a Mac version of it. But its exclusive development studio is the Xcode IDE.
And that's generally what you'll find people using for Mac.
There are also IDEs that are multi-platform. So Eclipse, you'll find Eclipse for Mac, for Windows, for Linux. NetBeans, same thing. Mono, same thing. Now Mono Develop is great. That's the C#, the open source C# stuff. NetBeans is Java, and Eclipse is basically whatever you want. You can configure Eclipse to be an IDE for many, many different languages.
NetBeans seems to be pretty common for anything from BlackBerry development to web services. It's also not exclusively a Java IDE, but primarily that's usually what you'd see people using it for.
Here is a screenshot of the Xcode IDE for Mac. Now, don't mind the code as much, but just take a look at these basic elements that we have. On the left portion, we have that project organization that we talked about before. So we can see that our program is set up. We have our source files here and our documentation here. So it's all in this little virtual directory structure. On the top, we have options for build and run. And as you can see on the right, I have this little green box that says, here is your ASCII text editor. So you can see that there are these three programs, or these three concepts combined into one program. And in the upper right-hand corner is the console. So when I execute the program, this is what the output is. So all of this is stuck inside of this Xcode IDE.
Now we go to the opposite end of the spectrum to a completely different IDE, Visual Studio. It's totally different. Absolutely different. As we can see, unlike the other one, we have the exact same debug, build, and run menu.
Yep.
The GUI tool or the ASCII editor basically in the same location, exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then a project organization. So the biggest difference basically between Xcode and Visual Studio is that the project organization is on the right side of the screen.
Yeah. Next we have KDevelop. Now what's really different between KDevelop and the other two? Not really that much.
But the project organization is back on the left side of the screen.
And we also have our run and debug options and our ASCII text editor. Of course, we have many other things like memory tools, but you can see that there's a trend here. They all kind of look the same. Now, this also kind of stems from the birth of the original integrated development environments, which we love QBasic. When we were little kids, Brian and I loved QBasic. It was our favorite thing in the world.
This is the first IDE that we've ever used.
And it's also one of the early ones, because it wasn't really until the 80s that you started seeing this.
Yeah.
So how does this differ from the other two? Not much. We still have our build, and we still have our ASCII text editor. The only thing we don't have is project organization, but at the time in the 90s and late 80s, code wasn't as complicated then, so it wasn't needed. Mm-hmm. But you can kind of see that even going back to the 90s up until now, the only thing that's changed is it looks prettier. But the functions are still there.
Absolutely.